This episode of the Fine Homebuilding podcast is brought to you by Loctite Tight Foam. Say no to inefficient and drafty. Say yes to Loctite Tight Foam. When pros need to seal gaps too small for insulation, but big enough to create a draft, they reach for Loctite's Tight Foam. The high-density foam forms a tenacious bond to most common building materials, stays flexible to prevent cracking, and keeps air, moisture, and pests out of the house. Whether you're adding R value to the rec room or finishing a boring basement, give that space a second chance with Loctite Tight Foam. Visit LoctiteProducts.com for more information.
Keep a honey pot, a small electrical honey pot, a small plumbing honey pot, a small pile of wood, and a bunch of fasteners. And if you live in the country, have a whole garage full of all this.
I have to say I totally agree on the fasteners.
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Podcast, our weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. I'm Senior Editor Patrick McComb. Today I'm joined by Bill Beleck of Nakamoto North America, Fine Homebuilding Senior Editor Brian Pontalillo, and our producer Jeff Rose. Please email your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being here today. It's a pleasure to see you.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bill, we should introduce you first. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. You work for Nakamoto North America. Can you please tell me first what your company does and what you do there?
Sure. So the Nakamoto family has been timberland owners and mill managers in Western Japan for over 100 years. And about, 8 years ago, we landed lumber into the North American market with a focus on the heat-treated lumber, known as yakisugi, also called Shou Sugi in the West. So in Japan, we do a variety of products. We're the largest siding mill in Japan, regular kiln-dried siding, also yakisugi siding, flooring, stair parts, a full range. But for North America, we chose to focus on exterior siding.
Are the forest products, do they come from Japan or do they come from all over?
Mostly, it depends on what type of material, what the end product is. The Nakamoto Group is the largest timberland owner in New Zealand. So they own radiata pine timberland. So that material is used for flooring, treads, door glue-ups, engineered products. But the exterior siding is made primarily from sugi, which is a Japanese cedar. It's a cypress species indigenous to Japan, but it's colloquially called Japanese cedar or Japanese cypress. But that is the sugi in Shou Sugi or yakisugi.
When I look at Bill, when I look at all these different varieties of Shou Sugi that you have on the website, you have a ton of different finishes, and it brings up this immediate question, which is that about the actual charring process. I always think of Shou Sugi as a very dark charred siding,
right?
But obviously you can achieve a lot of different looks, and so I'm curious: are they all charred siding?
Yes, they're all burned the same way. All the wood is burned in the same process. It's short duration. It's 2 to 3 minutes at about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit in a hot box type kiln. It's a little different than, it's just 2 to 3 minutes where the wood is burned dramatically. And that means every stick that goes through the kiln is covered in a heavy soot layer when it comes out the other end and is quenched. Designers. So we cater to designers, architectural and interior designers, and they always have some kind of a vision for their project. And in order to cater to their vision, we have to come up with a variety of products to match what they're interested in.
I'm sure the thing that people always ask you, because it's what comes to mind, is does it smell like burnt wood? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, but it's like going to a chocolate factory. It smells like chocolate, but after nobody who works there notices the chocolate anymore. So there's the cedar or the cypress has a fantastic aroma. It's like going into a closet that's clad with incense cedar. And our warehouse smells like that. And that's the primary aroma. The burned wood, it doesn't really smell like burned wood. It might be noticeable the first time you're exposed to it, but it really is. It's completely overwhelmed by the lumber aroma, actually.
Yeah.
So I think you'd agree, at least in North America, your products are, on the higher end. Is it similar in Japan and other places where it's sold, or is it more mainstream?
That is a good question. That's actually a really good question, Patrick, because historically this is a vernacular building material that is made in a simple, holistic process as efficiently as possible at the lowest price point achievable for the best long-term cost performance. And it is not a high-end building material historically. It's and when we brought it over here, we adapted our business model to achieve a low price point and not cater to the high end only, because we want to build a market. It's a very sustainable building material. It's like what the construction market needs, and to support that, we made the strategic decision to work on be very aggressive on price point and not just make a bunch of money off of the big high-end projects. So we'd like to, as ambassadors of this material from the home market, we would like to stay as authentic as possible, and that includes the projects we're going after.
Yeah. Is it popular elsewhere in the world, and where is it found commonly?
That's also a good question. It's all over the internet worldwide, but in terms of volume, just raw shipped and installed volume, the Japanese market dwarfs the entire world. We probably have 40 or 50% market share in North America, but we're still only a couple of percent of their capacity at the mills in Japan, just because it is used in tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of projects in Japan every year. So the EU market is not quite as big as North American market, especially this year because of the war in Ukraine that has been debilitating to the construction market in all of Europe severely. But up until a couple of years ago, they were probably about as big as the North American market. Otherwise, there's a patchwork of projects being installed here and there, South America, Central America, in the Middle East. But I think that originally the material probably came from China. The technology probably came from China or Korea, was brought over to Japan several hundred years ago. We're not sure. There's no definitive evidence, and we've done a bunch of research. But it either came over as a building material from the Korean side, and that's why it's concentrated in Western Japan and not in Eastern Japan or up north. This material comes from the closest point on the Japanese main island to the Korean peninsula. So that's one theory. And from the research that we've done, we think that it came from boat building, actually. Boats were built on land, on dry docks, and then they would burn the underside of the hull just to prevent rot and barnacles growing on it and to case harden the wood before they launch them, and that's theoretical. And as you guys probably know, carpenters have gone back and forth between boat building and construction since the beginning of time. And so our theory is that it came from one direction or another. But we found vintage burned wood on buildings in Wakayama and Okayama prefectures that originally came from boat holes. So we have found some evidence of that. But there's nothing conclusive historically in the written record that we can find beyond maybe 150 years ago. So we don't really know how old this technology is. But it's heat-treated wood, which goes back millennia. I mean, people have been heat-treating the tips of spears or digging sticks or fence posts or wine barrels. Or there are just so many iterations of heat-treated wood worldwide in human history that it all kind of melds together at some point.
So, Bill, after the heat treatment, I know that often the wood is also oiled, and I'm curious how, if that is if the sort of the function or the purpose of that is more durability, or if it's color and appearance, or a little bit of both.
Okay, that's another really good question, because that really is that's one of the main messaging points that we have. The wood is the secret sauce, not the coating. The basic premise of design with the Japanese yakisugi heat treatment is to make a coating unnecessary. So the wood is heat treated, and it doesn't have to be coated. It doesn't have to be maintained. It's just left in place until it wears out from UV degradation.
Is that part of the sustainability angle you guys are telling folks about, Bill? Is that?
Yes, absolutely. But the market drives the discussion at the end of the day, and people, they want a gray, a light gray or a dark gray, or they want a brown, or they want a black, and they want the color to stay the same for as long as possible. And so 40 years ago, the statistic is that 40 years ago, 80 to 90% of yakisugi delivered and installed in Japan was uncoated. But today it's the opposite. 80 to 90% is coated, and only 10 to 20% is uncoated anymore. And in the Western markets, that's even more pronounced, because North America, the construction industry in North America primarily comes from Europe. And Europe has a tradition of meticulous maintenance, especially with coatings, oil finishes, and paint.
Mm-hmm.
But to answer your question, Brian, absolutely. If the wood is coated, it will last long, because coatings have pigment in them, and the pigment is bonded to the wood with a binder. And that's what the linseed or latex or alkyd or what have you. There's some kind of a binder that glues the additives to the wood fibers. And the additives are primarily pigment, which is the primary UV blocker for protecting wood siding. And so there's the whole range of transparent oils on one end, all the way to a paint on the other end of the spectrum. And every type of coating out on the market is somewhere within that range.
Mm.
So what we've done is I'm most happy when somebody chooses an unoiled wood material for their house. But we have the full range of coating options for people, just according to their needs.
We're going to talk more about this, and I think it's important to note, Bill, you're currently building your own house, and Brian has recently done that. So the after show is going to be dedicated to talking about your new build and some of the decisions you've made in your very beautiful looking home. Are you planning to put Shou Sugi siding on your build?
Absolutely. And it's probably going to be unoiled. I've chose for the soffit. There's an exposed deck. It's not a soffit. It's an exposed deck, and I went with a KD Sugi on that, just a clear grade KD material. But for the walls, since the walls are exposed, we'll go with a heat treated material for that.
We're going to talk more about heat treating because one of my favorite podcast emails was from Tess. They made their own charred wood fencing, and I think the photo that she sent us is among my favorites that we've ever gotten on the podcast. It shows her husband torching some boards, and we'll talk more about the process in a little bit. As always, we heard from our fantastic listeners. This first comes from Alex, FHB Gang. You inquired if anyone had been charged more for services living in more expensive areas, and I have experienced this firsthand. I hired a contractor to do the masonry work for a garage I built and chatted him up about construction. He told me a story about a deck he built in Montgomery County. He gave the client a quote that he thought was high because he didn't really want to do the job. He ended up getting hired for it because the homeowner said he was the lowest bid. The contractor called this the Montgomery County tax. Montgomery County is just north of Washington, D.C., and there are some areas that are very expensive and other areas that are more middle income. To give you an idea of how much it costs to live in the area, my house is 750 square feet, 1,100 square feet, including the basement, and is valued at $650,000, and it's the kind of home that gets torn down around me. My 14-year-old has fired hot water heater, started leaking from the overpressure valve, and I decided to replace it considering its age. I figured I would replace it with an instantaneous hot water heater and got a quote from a plumber to install a new one for $18,000, not including the cost of the heater. When I asked for a breakdown of where the $18,000 was going, the plumber blew off my question. That was the only last time I'll ever pay for any kind of bid. $100 wasted. I found someone else who installed it for $2,000 plus the cost of the water heater. Love the podcast. Keep up the great work, Alex. So, Bill, have you heard of folks getting charged a premium if they live in the right zip code or wrong zip code, depending on your perspective?
Absolutely, that is a thing. A lot of that discussion is there are stories, there are case studies such as the one you just read about, but the insurance industry also drives costs and what contractors charge because the insurance adjustments are they're adapted to each region depending on the cost of labor in each region. And some regions are more expensive simply because they have a higher hurdle for compliance, where the contractors are required to go through a rigorous licensing program. And then other states don't have any licensing at all. And so, and then there's also the subject of labor availability, and some southern states might have more labor available than northern states.
What's your particular situation like? Is it? I'm guessing you're in an expensive area, and I'm guessing you have building concerns, notably seismic and fire, that also make things more expensive. Am I right? Yeah.
Absolutely. In your region in New England, you'll have a deeper foundation than we'll have here, but we'll have a more rigorous seismic code. So that absolutely affects cost. But in terms of an upcharge for being in a wealthy neighborhood, that's absolutely a thing. And the lesson is that contractors have the most difficult job in the world. It's so challenging to work on people's private spaces and passion projects, and people are very picky and sometimes difficult to deal with. And there's the old story of getting 3 bids, and do you take the highest one, middle one, or the lowest bid?
What do you do?
Ideally, you take the highest bid, but there's different theories. And whatever you do, you don't get more than 3 bids. Ideally, you would already have a contractor, and it's not calling a bunch of people and getting different prices. It's knowing who to call and trusting them, and just go in with their guidance on how to proceed with your project is ideal, whether it's time and materials or a fixed price. But never go for the low bid.
I think that that advice about knowing, getting the best referrals and the most referrals you can is so important. I've looked at bids for friends and family members on like roofing projects and or small deck projects, and what is most interesting to me is when there's a scope of work that looks exactly the same and yet the price can be $10,000 from one roofer and $17,000 from the next. And I go line by line through the materials that they're planning to use and the details that they're planning to execute, and it's exactly the same. So what's the difference? In what's that $7,000 difference? And maybe as people have noted many times before on the show, maybe it's a contractor that's busy, and so cranks up the prices a little bit. But when you start to look at referrals, I think often you will find that it matches a high quality company.
Alex's contractor couldn't not take the job. He tried and it didn't work.
Well, I think overall, so we sell to contractors. Contractors are our customers. I used to be a contractor. It's a hard way to make a living, but contractors really get a bad rap.
I agree.
By and far, they're good people in an ethical career, just trying to satisfy their clients. And but there's so many pitfalls with their job. There's so many ways to lose money as a contractor, and so they're kind of conditioned to squeeze as much profit out of projects as possible.
Oh yeah, because you might lose your shirt on the next one too, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
You mentioned a lot of the challenges that contractors have, but I think you skipped one. It's just like the dollar amounts involved for most of us far exceed anything else we pay for. It's
Right.
just not even a comparison. So that makes people on edge to begin with.
Absolutely.
Our second email comes from Alex. He quoted me saying, I can't afford an electric car. And he says, Patrick, if you do the math, you'll find that owning an electric car is cheaper than an equivalent gas car. Below is a link to a spreadsheet using actual numbers for the state of Maryland. I'll put the link on the podcast page for those of you who are interested. Ignoring things like a panel upgrade, installing a level 2 charger, and other expenses associated with either vehicle, over a 10-year period, it's cheaper to own a Tesla Model 3 than a Honda Civic. If you keep a car longer, it becomes even more cost effective. Well, I don't think you can ignore those upgrades that you need to charge an electric car for starters. And I'm still going to argue that an electric car is more expensive than the cars that I have that are paid for. But excluding those considerations, it makes a valid argument as far as the cost per mile if you're comparing, a new gas car to a new electric vehicle. What do you think about this, Brian? Are you convinced?
I've seen this spreadsheet and others like it in people's personal, experiences with their electric cars that point to it being more cost effective to have an electric car. Of course, there's a lot of variables, right? That could change from one location to another, from one vehicle to another, and maybe even as fuel prices, kind of wax and wane over the life of that whatever vehicle you have. I'm just personally, I'm just waiting out the cars that we have. And I think that our next vehicle will probably be an electric vehicle, but I'm going to drive these things until I can't drive them anymore.
I'm guessing Jeff shares that perspective. Am I right, Jeff?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Bill, do you have an electric car?
4 of them.
Okay.
We transitioned our company vehicles to electric last year. We had to upgrade, and it was time to get a new car. And I had bought my wife a Leaf a few years ago, 3.5 years ago, and she loves it. Then I bought myself an EV earlier this year, and it's so emancipating not to have to put in gas. You just plug it in when you get home in the evening or at the end of the workday. And it's fully charged the next day. There's so many issues here involved. Do you get the commuter? with the short range, or do you go for the big battery and then drag a big battery around as you commute? And so that's a decision we all have to make. And you can crunch the numbers different ways. Statistically, a plug-in hybrid will be 35 times as sustainable as the standard EV, is one statistic. But if you look at how many miles you put on your car, even though you're doing the 10-mile or whatever commute every day, most miles are put on the highway. And so it can be argued either way. But what the deal maker for us is that the EVs are so fun to drive. They're so easy. They're quiet. You can hear the radio. They have all these accoutrements because they're new. They're super
I couldn't
nice.
help but notice you didn't mention what vehicle you bought. Did you get the Model X Tesla with the gull-wing doors?
No. I personally, I went with the Y. I mean, it's people make fun of me for driving that brand of car, but
they're pretty nice. I've been in them. That's a pretty amazing vehicle.
The spec sheet, just looking at the numbers and the specs, and that's what I made my decision based on. And I didn't take any media chatter into consideration. I just went straight with metrics.
Has it been reliable? Have you had any trouble with it?
Oh, we went to EVs on our forklifts also. We've got 2 Doossons and 2 electric Heisters now, and there's almost no maintenance on them. Once you go to an EV, there's no maintenance. You don't do anything anymore. You fill up the tires. That's it.
No sunroof leaks. That's the thing I've heard about that kind of frustrate people. Yeah, no, that's good. I think anyone who's been in the warehouse business would say that electric forklifts have been mainstream for decades, right? It's a great way to run, big equipment indoors.
They're so nice. They don't leak oil. The old forks leak mostly between the transmission and the motor. Always. It's like a Toyota always leaks. The Heisters always leak. They're top of the line, but they always leak oil. And so it's a slip concern in the warehouse. And the electric forklifts don't leak a drop of anything. They're quiet. They're so nice.
I got to think that the lack of or the reduced maintenance has got to be a huge factor in that world too. When you're talking about forklifts being down and needing to be serviced.
The only problem there is we've got a mechanic that comes in, and he's serviced our forklifts for the last several years, and he's a friend of mine. And now we don't have work for him anymore.
That is a change in the world, right? It's
He said that any of his clients that transition to electric are no longer his clients. There's just no work to do anymore.
Wow. So we're going to turn back to the subject of charred wood siding, Bill, because I dug back up this email back up from Tess regarding her fencing project. I believe it was in Michigan. And she says, next came the moment where one decision tripled the amount of work the fence would take. Instead of taking the easy way and staining the 6-foot deck boards black, we decided to do a fence in the traditional Japanese style of yakisugi, sometimes referred to as Shou Sugi. The main benefit of this traditional technique is to give the wood incredible resistance to the elements and durability. So what we did is we bought 500 feet of 6-foot untreated cedar deck boards, and in batches of 60, set them up vertically on a homemade stand in the driveway. Our best results were stacking the boards 3 deep and 20 wide. This minimized the amount of setup time and helped limit the number of boards knocked off the stand by wind. For anyone attempting this at home, I'd recommend the Ideal Gas single head heating torch, as the enclosed nozzle keeps the electrical starter from melting 100 boards in. The wood goes through a process of 1, first char on both sides, 2, brush both sides with water and an acrylic bristle broom to remove the first layer of loose char, and then a second char on both sides, followed by 2 coats of alkyd oil per side. What baffles me is that for the past 5 months, the attendants at the gas station have never questioned how we could be going through 2 15-pound propane tanks every 2 hours on the weekends. We didn't do the traditional flue method, living in the suburbs of Minneapolis. That seemed like too good a reason for someone to call the fire department on us. Even so, I was nervous about the neighbors and kept checking next door to see if anyone wrote in about the crazy millennials down the street with a flamethrower. But we found as this project actually had a very positive reaction from our neighbors. It gave them an excuse to stop by on their walks, ask questions, and cheer us on. It was much needed as we transitioned into the digging phase of the project. So, Tess and her husband figured out how to do this in the backyard. Can you talk about the industrial process, Bill? Is it at all similar to what Tess did?
No. But the story of this material is that, like I said earlier, it's vernacular, and it used to be made on the job site by the contractors for each project. That's
just like you would stain or paint siding conventionally, and
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So in Japan, there is factory-made yakisugi, and there's also yakisugi that's still made by old-fashioned contractors. It's just a lot of work, like Tessa had mentioned. It's a lot of work, and the torch method. When we first launched here, I was nervous about people doing it themselves, such as you just described, as Tessa just described, because we were concerned about inconsistency in how people were doing it. And there was a bunch of negative feedback we got in the beginning about soot washing off almost immediately after installation, and this problem and that problem. So the industrial process is basically designed to mimic the traditional way of burning the boards with a flue method. What's important is that to get effective heat treatment and consistent heat treatment across the board, if you use a torch, how do you know to slow down in the sections that are more dense? And how deeply do you burn it? And is there one person doing the entire scope from left to right, from the first board to the 500th board, or are there 3 different people doing it 3 different ways? And then you have to get into, which species are you burning? Is it kiln dried? Is it air dried? What are the dimensions? What's the moisture content? And it really is a holistically made building material. And so to get a consistent result that performs well for the long term, there are these rules that have been developed in Japan over generations. And so it's I don't know what to comment other than the hot box method is more consistent. But I have to root for people that do it themselves. Some people do 3,000 or 4,000 square feet themselves on a job site. And I can't imagine, it's so much labor to do it by hand.
So you can, in the industrial process, get rid of the char or prevent it, or prevent some of the inconsistencies and complaints people might have. Is that a correct assessment? Yeah.
Well, there's like I said, a bunch of factors such as species. We use a species that the heat treatment has kind of been optimized for in Japan over hundreds of years, and they use one species. Like the Nakamoto Zorin in Japan does not use radiata pine. They use specifically sugi, and they air dry it. That's the second step. What's important on the species is that it's a porous softwood species that dries out quickly, which is important for exterior siding. So in North America, we use the range of cedars, redwood, cypresses for exterior siding historically, unless it's painted. If it's stain grade, we'll use a porous softwood. If it's paint grade, you can really use a number of species. But also the cypress has a very thick latewood growth ring, which results in a soot layer that doesn't fall off quickly. It's robust and durable for long term. And you can't heat treat wood twice. You can't use kiln dried wood and then burn it and expect the boards to be dimensionally stable. So we're trying to improve dimensional stability. If you're not careful about that, then the boards can move all over the place and check dramatically.
Do you have to put it on a rain screen like we suggest other types of wood siding?
Any kind of cladding should be on a rain screen. It doesn't matter what it's made from, whether it's cement, metal, or wood. It really should be on a rain screen.
Was that, I'm going to ask you, when you were a builder, was that your standard practice?
No.
Okay.
No. I was taught to install siding directly over the vapor barrier because when I was a kid, it was all transitioned to plywood by the time I was born, but we were still using asphalt impregnated paper felt at the time. But in the modern world, we have to have the nail-based sheeting, certified structural sheeting, which is basically a hermetic seal or close to it. And then most of the vapor barriers nowadays are resin-based. And so that traps water between the WRB and the siding. So you have to have some kind of airflow to prevent stale air and black mold. And so that's where the rain screen is a modern concept that needs to be accepted by the building industry here. It's just not mandated by code because we have a federal system without a national building code, such as they have in Japan or Western Europe. And so
you're
really,
in a wildfire interface, am I right? Is that a worry? Yeah.
actually, I expected the rain screen to perform worse in a fire scenario, but we're going through the certification process with CAL FIRE right now because all of the Western states are following the California Department of Forestry Fire Department mandated compliance now. And the laboratory testing shows that rain screen actually performs better with resisting fire than putting wood siding directly over the vapor barrier, believe it or not.
We should say, I think you mean water resistant barrier, right? Behind the exterior. Yeah. Does the Shou Sugi also resist fire? Is it naturally fire resistant? Okay.
It is. I thought that was an urban legend when I first got involved in this business. But then we sent wood down to the laboratory for the ASTM E84 flame spread testing, and it's dramatic. The soot layer, what we've learned is the wood is case hardened, and so oxygen doesn't penetrate as quickly as unburned wood. But more importantly, the soot layer is soot has a higher temperature of ignition than wood does. So wood is, I believe it's 450 or 500 degrees, whereas soot is 600 to 700 degree ignition temperature, and that makes all the difference. So for example, our unbrushed Suyaki material is a Class A flame spread rating, which is the same category as masonry. It's dramatic how much it slows fire down. And the western fire zone, the high fire zones, Rockies and West, is now our biggest market, together with New England. The New England market and the western high fire zones are the two regions of North America that we ship the most wood to.
Brian, you've seen this out in the wild, am I right? You've seen homes with this
not many, but I have seen a few. And it's an aesthetic, it's a look that I've always kind of really liked. I do have I have a few questions while we're on the subject and have an expert here. A few more questions about it, and one is just sort of a clarification, Bill. I think of, and probably many people think of, this material as being charred, but you keep using the term heat treated. And so I'm wondering, is there a difference that it would be helpful to understand between sort of what happens with the actual charring versus the heat treatment? Could you heat treat this material, get the same effect of durability without actually charring the material for that look?
Yes, actually, that's a good question because there are so many different types of heat treatment. The basic premise of heat treating wood is that wood is composed of lignin and hemicellulose. And so when it's heat treated, the temperature is raised enough to where it burns off the hemicellulose and the structural lignin remains. There are three different heat treatment technologies that are used on construction lumber that I'm aware of, other than standard kiln drying. And kiln drying is a complex subject, as I'm sure you're aware. There's so many different ways to do it and a lot of know-how involved. But that's mostly having to do with moisture content and case hardening. In China, there's a carbonization technology where they heat the wood up to a high temperature and burn off all the hemicellulose down to the center of the plank, and it turns the planks black. It's mostly used for flooring and decking, say flooring that you could put directly on concrete and not have to worry about it rotting. It's that robust. And then in Finland, over the last few decades, thermal modification has been developed. It's been a public-private partnership. And thermowood.fi is a great resource to learn about that technology. But basically, they take lumber and they'll dry it out and then steam it, dry it out a second time, steam it a second time, and then do a final drying of the material. And that, it's about 450 degrees Fahrenheit. It penetrates deeply into the wood. They get about 2 inches of penetration, so it can be used on a piece of wood up to about 4 inches thick. And it basically burns off all of the hemicellulose that deeply. And there's a loss of about 9% structural integrity. So the breaking point will be slightly affected, and also the wood is slightly more brittle, but not too much that it can't be used for framing lumber, such as for decking, for framing a deck or pergolas. It can be used on a cladding material, but the yakisugi, the Japanese technology, it's a short duration charring process where the wood is actually burned. So the Japanese technology is the burning technology. And it's a surface treatment specifically designed to treat thin plank materials. If we try to burn a thick piece of wood, then the moisture content in the center of the board will stay at 10 or 15%. The surface will go down to 0, which causes the boards to move. So they'll check and move dramatically, so we can't get a straight piece of wood over 6 or 8 feet long. But siding needs to be beautiful, as long as possible, and straight. So it's a cosmetic facade, and so it's more important that we use a species and treat the surface so that it is beautiful and it stays looking good for a long time. But they're all heat treatments.
Yeah, I guess the other thing I wanted to ask you, because we have a lot of hands-on people listening to this podcast, is just about installation. Is there anything unique to working with this material as a carpenter who might be installing it?
It's just wood siding like any other kind of wood siding. I used to install red cedar and yellow pine siding and even cement board. It's basically the same tricks of the trade, same trade craft. The differences would be the window and other penetration details have to be considered. They have to be designed out because the yakisugi material is thinner. We can't do 3/4 or 13/16 or 4/4. We can only do up to about 5/8 inch thickness. And we can't do, say, 10-inch wide boards. They'll check dramatically. And so our width parameter, And we can't do thin boards either because they'll crook and crown and twist. So the specification parameters are more limited. Plus, with modern best practice discussion, because it's a new product to the market, we have to warrant it just to get people to feel comfortable with using it. And in exchange for the warranty, we ask for a screen wall assembly installation. And so with most window frames being designed at 4/4 or 5/4 proud of the sheeting, that creates a scenario where the architect and builder have to figure out how to do the screen wall assembly within that wall depth parameter.
Or pad out the casing, or do other back band or some other way to hide that thickness, I'm guessing, is the problem, right?
Exactly. And in Western Europe, that's standard, where they'll put a return outboard of the window frames and then terminate the siding into it, or the other way around. But here, people aren't used to doing that. And if it's a fixed price bid and they're competing against somebody else that's not quoting a screen wall assembly, it just turns into a discussion. So basically, it is educating the market more than our product being different than other lumber.
What about, I'm guessing it's kind of rectangular in cross section. It's not a beveled siding like would be customary in the Northeast, right? Do you scarf joints? Do you butt joints? I mean, go ahead.
In Japan, you'll see almost exclusively butt joints, whether it's a vertical or horizontal layout. They'll cut the board square. They don't even paint the ends of the boards. They just keep going with the install. And over here, we recommend a scarf joint at 15 to 22 degrees, just in case, and painting the ends of the boards so that because we're shipping to so many different regions, we're shipping to the high Rockies where it's extremely arid, and we're shipping to New England, right on the coast. And so just to avoid any kind of inconsistent moisture content or wood movement, we recommend the scarf joint. So if the boards shrink and expose that cut, it'll be painted. And so you won't see the blonde color of the wood. You'll see the black or gray or brown in painting. And if the wood, we've never had a buckling issue, but just by best practice, it's better to put a scarf joint in case, say, the wood is left out in the sun in the summer and it's installed dry at 6 or 8% moisture content right on the coast, and then come winter the wood goes up to 13 or 14% MC, then the concern is buckling. We've never had that issue, but best practice would be a scarf joint theoretically.
Where's the best place for folks to get more information about installing the product, or what the available finishes are, sizes, all of it?
Our website has a menu bar that hopefully is easy to navigate for people. There's a specifications page that has an installation manual that we wrote. It's a best practices manual, but adapted to our product.
Do you want to give the website, Bill?
NakamotoForestry.com is our website.
We're going to talk more about your house, and I'm guessing you're using these products on your own home, so we'll talk more about that. This comes from John Paul. As an ambitious DIYer, I tackle nearly all the home repair and improvement projects in our house and studio/shop outbuilding. I often have material left over, a little lumber, paint supplies, plumbing, and electrical fittings. I never know whether to save or return these items. I'm sure it is handy to have this stuff on hand for efficient repairs, but it can take up a lot of space, and it's easy to spend a lot of time looking for stuff. I'm sure I have maybe as much time as a run to the hardware store. How do you decide what items to keep in stock and what to return? Have you found efficient ways to store and quickly find many things used to build and maintain houses? I'll go first because I'll just be brief. Keep like stuff with like stuff, whether it's a box, a bin, a laundry basket, whatever. I try and return stuff that's more than a few bucks. Electrical fittings I usually hold on to. Plumbing fittings, it depends on whether it's the Pro Press stuff, right, Jeff, or the normal soldered fittings. Yeah, I mentioned the ProPress specifically because those fittings are like $5, $6, $7, $20 each. So there's some real money when you return that. Who wants to go next? Thoughts on this, Brian?
Yeah, it's always a judgment call. If something is a more expensive item and I'm less likely to need it in the future, then I'll return it. If it is a less expensive item or something that I'm likely to need in the future, I will probably keep it. And if probably not a lot of people watch the Fine Homebuilding podcast. Probably most people listen to it. But if just looking at Patrick's screen, the other thing that I do, or at least have done more recently, is I have just installed a lot of shelves. I used to have minimal shelves, and everything, like, things were piled in boxes and I never knew where stuff was. And I think shelves are a worthwhile investment, whether you make them from your own scraps or you just buy a whole bunch of like the heavy duty wire shelving. I love the unfinished part of my basement now because my tools, my materials, and the things that I have in storage are neatly organized on shelves, and I can just go down there and grab what I need very easily now. So,
good job.
Yeah.
Jeff?
I like you. It's like, the electrical stuff goes in a bin, the plumbing stuff goes in a bin. But I keep everything. I keep every scrap of wood. It's just, I'm really bad about that.
Bill, I can always tell when I go to a yard sale of a former or present contractor because they have more stuff than anyone else by a factor. How did you deal with that as a contractor, having stuff left over, and what do you do now?
That is a really good question because contracting, keeping your leftover materials is a slippery slope, and it's just impossible. It's not a good idea to keep everything. But I think it really depends on how far you are from the hardware store.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep a honey pot. I keep a honey pot of fasteners. The full range of fasteners, don't return fasteners. Keep them. Always have a fastener honey pot as priority. And then I keep just a minimum volume of lumber in different dimensions. Not a giant pile. You don't want to keep a giant pile of lumber next to your house unless you're saving it for a project. But it's good to have 2x, 4x. It's good to have 1x in different widths, different species. If there's any molding left over from working on the interior or exterior of your house, keep the molding.
So you can replace it later or add things and have matching stuff. Yeah, good idea.
Right, or you might just notice a spot you forgot about. 2 years
What do you guys think about like tile for a tile floor? Or I find myself, I save that stuff, of course, because you can never get it later, but I just end up moving it 1,000 times and never using it.
Put tile under the bushes in a hidden spot where
Just
it'll
put
be
it
there
outside.
in 20 years.
That's a great
when you need it in 20 years to replace one piece.
And attic stock has been a thing of the slater's trade forever. These are slate you put up in the attic so you can do patches because inevitably the slate quarry closes or the color changes or the sizes are different. But I also have bundles of shingles that I swear I've moved 12 times, and that gets kind of old. What do you guys say? Case by case basis, right? It's
always a hard decision. It really is. I mean, every time. Yeah.
Keep a honey pot, a small electrical honey pot, a small plumbing honey pot, a small pile of wood, and a bunch of fasteners. And if you live in the country, have a whole garage full of all that stuff.
I have to say I totally agree on the fasteners. Like that's something that I always keep, even if I'm down to just a few of them, then I have like I have one container that's just random stuff that I can look through. But anything else, I just I always save those because inevitably you will need or want a fastener, and to have it is, and if you only need a few, to have a few laying around and not have to go buy a box. That's a trip to the hardware store and money you don't need to spend.
I kind of agree with like electrical fittings too. When you are doing something electrical and you need a switch or an outlet or a wall plate or an electrical box, stuff is not that expensive. It's nice to have a milk crate of all those things and be able to complete a project or fix something without having to run to the hardware store.
Hey, I want to go back to something really quickly, Patrick, because I forgot to mention this before when we were talking about the fence. And how she mentioned how her neighbors were not offended by their project, but instead were curious. And it made me think about it made me think of something that I've thought of many times over the years, but it just struck me for the first time how nice it is, or how it struck me that what happens when you work on your property is that you meet your neighbors.
Amen. Yeah.
On both of the last, the house we remodeled and now the house we built, I probably made more connections with the neighbors because of the projects that I was doing, because of being outside, having something going on and people stopping by with curiosity.
Landscaping too, Brian.
Yes.
Yeah. Carol's gardening addiction fosters all kinds of conversations with all kinds of people walking by and neighbors. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, it's really wonderful.
One more question. This comes from Corey. Hello, FHB. Your group is awesome, inspiring me to tackle some basement insulation. I live in Roanoke, Virginia, and have a walkout basement, which is 75% below grade. It's currently unfinished. I'm currently insulating the rim joist with 2-inch XPS. Phase 1 of, I'm not sure. I plan to follow up with 2 inches on the concrete walls, then studs/insulation and drywall. I've knocked out the first dozen or so of the joist cavities, and I'm starting to get at the hang of the foam gun. My scenario is I have about 10 to 12 cavities that cantilever over the concrete around 3 feet. Part of the kitchen is above the cantilever, and below the cantilever is outside, obviously. It's below a patio grade is below. But before the patio base was laid, I covered the underside with tar paper and 2-inch XPS. The cantilever pockets were previously filled with fiberglass bats. My question is, with all the nail protrusions into the cantilevered cavities from sheathing under the bump out, cabinets and flooring above, and the dimensions, getting foam into these areas and foam in place will definitely be challenging. I could try to knock down the nails and get the 3-foot pieces of tubing to seal the XPS sections, or should I plan to froth pack these areas myself and keep on moving on? The cavities have some light mold, likely from poor air sealing. Any insight you could share would be great. I'd love your input even before this is considered for podcast airing. So I'll paraphrase for Corey here. He has an overhanging section of floor system. It's about 3 foot long. He needs to air seal the space from the outside, and he wants to know how to do it. And he's asking, is there another way besides the tedious cutting and fitting of pieces of XPS insulation into these rectangular holes? Any thoughts, gentlemen?
Well, I think the froth pack is certainly a solution if he has access to get all 6 sides of of each bay with the froth pack, and then really just to do the air sealing, and then he can put any kind of fibrous insulation inside those areas to fill them. So that's because I don't know, that would be really tedious to try to do all well, I guess he's done the bottom from the outside, but to get 3 feet, to reach 3 feet in and do that rim area with a cut and cobble approach. The only thing that I think is that if it's a small area, the froth packs, they go pretty far. So if he's going to buy froth packs, he might want to hold off on some of the other rim areas for a little while, so he has somewhere to use up that material before he starts.
Bill, thoughts on this?
I agree.
With the froth pack?
More insulation is better than less insulation to begin with. But I agree with Brian's approach.
Jeff, what do you think?
Yeah, unless still has access from the outside where he could do some of that stuff from below, but I don't know what, it's hard to say.
It seems like he already sealed that up, and if he did that, then we know what the answer is. But if you haven't, Corey, I would do it from the outside, assuming it's not too close to grade. The froth packs are great. I've probably used more of them than most people in Justin Fink's attic. You may remember that, Brian.
Yes.
They're pretty great. By all accounts, make sure the temperatures are high. This is not a winter project. You got to do this when this is hot out. Otherwise, you get poor reactions, and that makes a mess. So you don't want to deal with that. But I think this is a great opportunity to use one of those products. They're kind of expensive, but it's going to be, hours of work instead of days of tedious fussing around with it. So sometimes things just
follow the like Patrick said, follow the directions, make sure the temperatures are right. Best case scenario, you use it all up quickly. But if you don't, heed the manufacturer's warnings to spray a little bit out every few days so that the materials don't crystallize in the gun, and then you have to order another handle. So, but yeah, if you I don't love spray foam as a material, but it's a problem solver, and this is the kind of situation where you're probably going to improve efficiency and comfort by using one.
I'm going to go further than Brian and say use it all at once. Have enough work that you have plenty of stuff to do with it, and just use it all up, because it's expensive to waste it, and kind of an environmental hit too. So, Bill, I can't wait to talk about your house.
Great. I can't wait till it's done.
Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Thanks to Bill, Brian, and Jeff for joining me, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Keep craft alive. Thanks very much for listening. Bill, you've been great. Thanks for being here.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.